All right, ready to dive into some fascinating economics.
Always up for a good economic deep dive.
You sent over some seriously intense textbook excerpts, so it seems we're tackling some core principles today.
The essentials.
Scarcity, choice,
The bedrock of, well, how we navigate this world, really.
of limited resources, and let's be honest, our own never-ending wants.
It's that classic conundrum, isn't it?
It really is, and it seems from these excerpts that even something as seemingly simple as, well, the idea of scarcity underpins a huge amount of economic thought.
It's true. The excerpts you shared really dig into this idea, that people generally prefer, well, having more rather than less.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
I mean, who wouldn't want more happiness, more resources, more of those things we enjoy?
Precisely. And that's where it gets interesting because if we didn't constantly desire more, then limited resources wouldn't even be a problem, would they?
It's that age-old desire for more that really creates, I guess, the central tension in economics, right?
Get it.
How we decide to allocate those scarce resources to satisfy our just endless wants.
Exactly. It's like that classic Rolling Stones lyric. You can't always get what you want.
Huh. Too true. But this isn't just about me picking between a bag of chips or a chocolate bar at the store, is it? I mean, the excerpts mention some pretty big picture examples.
Oh, absolutely. Take, for example, the baby boom generation.
Okay.
The excerpts, they highlight how even something as complex as a population boom can be analyzed, through an economic lens.
Wait, really? Economics can explain the baby boom?
Oh, absolutely.
How so?
Well, it all comes down to understanding the economic incentives and constraints that influence, well, decisions like family size. So think about things like the cost of living after, say, a major global event like World War II,
Right.
or even societal norms around, family size at the time. All of these factors play a role, and they can be woven into economic models to help us understand these kinds of demographic shifts.
Okay, that's really interesting. But I have to ask, how do economists go from something as complex as a population boom to equations and models? It seems like a big leap.
It is. It is a leap, but it's a carefully calculated one, I assure you.
Okay.
Economists use models, you see. Think of them as simplified representations of reality to help them understand these intricate relationships. Imagine, for a moment, that you're building a model airplane. You wouldn't include every single rivet and wire, would you?
No, not at all.
You simplify to understand the aerodynamics, the bigger picture. Economic models are very similar.
So it's about creating a framework to understand those, well, core forces at play, not necessarily mimicking every single detail of reality, right?
Exactly. These models, they start with certain assumptions. Things like, this idea that people prefer more goods to less. But here's the crucial part. These assumptions, they're used to develop testable hypotheses.
Okay, yeah.
And then we look at real-world data, you see. We ask, does the hypothesis hold up? And if not, well, we refine the model. It's this continuous process of, observation and improvement.
So it's not about predicting the future with perfect accuracy,
No, not at all.
but rather creating a structured way to think about, well, cause and effect in a system that is inherently very complex.
Right. You've got it. And the text really emphasizes a key point here, and that is distinguishing between what we call assertions, like the idea that people prefer more, versus testable assumptions, the ones we can actually observe and validate.
Yeah, I see.
This distinction is key to how economic models are developed and refined over time.
Almost like the scientific method, right? You form a hypothesis, you test it, and then you adjust it based on the results.
Precisely.
But we're dealing with human behavior here, not just chemical reactions in a beaker.
That's what makes it so interesting. Human behavior, you see, it adds layers of complexity, but also richness to these models. It's about understanding not just the what, but the why behind economic decisions.
And that's where those equations sprinkled throughout these excerpts come into play.
Right.
Right? I mean, we can't escape the math entirely, can we?
We can't, I'm afraid, but we can certainly make them less intimidating.
Okay, good. Because I was starting to get a little nervous.
Not to worry.
So remind me again.
Remember those testable hypotheses we talked about?
Right.
Equations are just a precise and concise way to express those hypotheses. Think of them as a specialized language for describing economic relationships.
A language that uses
Numbers instead of words.
numbers instead of words. Okay.
Precisely. And just like learning any new language, it takes a bit of effort, but once you grasp the basics, you can unlock a whole deeper level of understanding.
Okay, so walk me through one of these equations. I see one here. It's about marginal cost and marginal revenue.
Okay.
It seems to suggest that the more you produce of something, the less each additional unit is worth. Am I reading that right?
You're exactly right. That's what economists call the concept of diminishing returns.
Okay.
And it's a fundamental principle in economics. It helps explain why, for instance, airlines offer different fare classes.
Okay.
They're trying to capture different levels of willingness to pay by offering, well, a range of options, from basic economy to first class.
Ah, interesting.
So you see, those equations,
Yeah.
as intimidating as they might seem,
At first glance.
at first glance, yes,
Mm.
they're really just tools to help us understand these real-world phenomena, like pricing strategies.
Right, okay. So they're actually our friends.
They are our friends.
Once we get to know them a little better. It's amazing how these models can, like, connect the dots between such different things. Consumer behavior, business decisions, even something as big as, international trade.
Yeah.
It's like having a secret decoder ring for the economy.
That's a great way to put it. It's the beauty of economics, I think. It gives you this framework for understanding choices and incentives, across so many different situations. But
Yeah.
we have to remember models are just that, models.
Right.
They can't predict everything.
Right. The real world is messy. It's unpredictable. So how do we avoid, I guess, falling into that trap of thinking these models are, foolproof?
Well, that's where critical thinking comes in.
Right.
The excerpts really stress that. We can't just blindly apply these models without considering the real-world context, you see. One really key aspect of critical thinking is understanding the assumptions built into a model.
Okay.
For example, many economic models just assume something called perfect information.
Perfect information. So, like, everyone knows everything about the market.
Exactly. Prices, supply, demand, all of it.
Wow.
But in reality, we know that's rarely the case.
Right. But,
Think about, say, buying a used car.
okay. Yeah. Yeah.
You never know for sure if it's a lemon or not, right?
Right.
Or think about, investing in the stock market. If everyone had perfect information, there wouldn't be any risk.
Right. No one would ever lose money.
Exactly.
So how do we account for those? Well, those inevitable information gaps.
That's a great question. Economists have actually developed some very sophisticated ways to incorporate what we call imperfect information into their models.
Okay.
It's about understanding how people make decisions with limited or even inaccurate information.
Right.
And then there's this assumption of perfectly rational behavior.
Right. Yeah.
Traditional economics often assumes that people, they always act in their own self-interest.
Right.
But, we all know from our own lives,
Yeah.
we don't always make the most rational choices.
We're human. We have emotions. We have biases. And sometimes, we just plain make mistakes.
Exactly. And you know what? There's a whole field now called behavioral economics
Oh, right.
that delves into those psychological factors influencing economic decisions. It's really a fascinating area of study, I think, one that really challenges some of those classic economic assumptions.
Right. Like that we always make the perfectly rational decision.
Yeah.
Yeah, that definitely doesn't almost, actually, that almost never happens.
That's the beauty of it.
So it sounds like economics is this, constantly evolving field. It's incorporating new ideas, refining its models. It's not just like this static set of rules, but a very dynamic way of, thinking about the world.
You got it. It's a journey, not a destination. And speaking of journeys,
Yes.
the excerpts you shared, they actually dive into some pretty advanced math here.
Okay.
Things like Taylor series, Jacobians, Hessians.
Yeah, you're not kidding. When I saw those terms, I definitely had a flashback to my college calculus class, and it was not a pleasant one.
I hear you, but don't worry, we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty here.
Okay, good.
But I thought it might be, helpful to at least understand why these tools are so important to economists.
Yeah, please. I mean, to me, those just look like a bunch of, well, really scary equations.
I understand. But these advanced mathematical tools, they essentially allow economists to create much more sophisticated and nuanced models.
Okay.
They help them capture those complexities of real-world economic relationships that often aren't linear or straightforward, you see.
Okay.
For instance, think about production function.
Okay.
This model shows how inputs, like,
Right.
say, labor and capital, are transformed into outputs, like goods and services.
Mm-hmm.
Advanced math allows economists to go beyond those simple models to ones that incorporate factors like, say, diminishing returns,
Yeah.
where adding more of an input doesn't always lead to proportional increases in output.
Right.
Or even things like economies of scale,
Right.
where producing more can actually lower the average cost per unit.
So it's like upgrading from like a basic calculator to a really powerful computer. You can tackle more challenging and intricate problems.
That's a great analogy. That's exactly it. With those advanced tools, economists can analyze a much wider range of scenarios, such as, how companies adjust their production in response to, say, fluctuating input prices,
Right.
or how government policies like taxes or subsidies, can influence production decisions. It just adds a whole other layer of, depth and nuance to economic analysis.
Okay. Now, there was something mentioned in the text here that really piqued my interest called duality.
Duality, yes.
And I have to say, well, it sounds a bit philosophical, almost like we're venturing into, like the Matrix or something.
It does have a certain ring to it, doesn't it? But no need to plug into a simulation just yet.
Okay, good.
Duality in economics, at its essence, it refers to this fundamental symmetry that's often found in economic models. It's about recognizing that many economic problems, they actually have two sides, you see.
Okay.
Like two sides of the same coin.
Two sides of the same coin. Okay, give me an example. I'm intrigued.
Okay, sure. Let's say you're a business owner, right? And you're trying to figure out how to, produce a certain level of output, but at the lowest possible cost.
Okay.
That's your cost minimization problem. Now, flip the coin over.
Okay.
You could also look at this as a profit maximization problem, where you're figuring out how much output to produce to earn the highest possible profit given your costs.
Ah, I see. So it's the same underlying economic forces. They're just being viewed from opposite perspectives, right?
Exactly.
Okay, that's actually really cool.
Isn't it? And this duality, it pops up in many different areas of economics.
Right?
It can be applied to things like consumer choices, market equilibrium, even how we analyze things like social welfare. It's this really powerful concept, that just highlights how interconnected all these different economic ideas really are.
It's like looking at an economic problem through 3D glasses,
Hmm.
Same data,
Right.
but with like this added dimension of understanding.
I like it.
I really like how, all of these models, they connect what seems like the micro,
Yes.
what an individual firm does,
Yep.
to the macro, the dynamics of, a whole industry or even like the global economy.
Yes. That's one of the most fascinating aspects of economics. You're right. It connects those individual decisions to the bigger picture.
Right.
And speaking of connecting the dots,
Yeah.
the text here delves into how these things called cost functions,
Okay.
basically the minimum cost of producing, different levels of output,
Okay.
they are derived from the behavior of those individual firms. It's like, if you're zooming out from a single factory to suddenly see this entire supply chain of in-industry.
So we're going from the micro, what's happening on the factory floor, to the macro, the overall supply and demand in the entire market.
Precisely. And understanding these cost functions is key to analyzing things like market structure, how much competition exists, and even the effects of, say, government regulations on industries. It helps us understand how all those little puzzle pieces of the economy, they actually fit together.
Right. Okay. We've covered a lot of ground here, from like those very basic assumptions to very complex mathematical tools.
We have. It's quite a lot.
But now the text seems to be, shifting gears a bit here. We're moving into this realm of consumer demand functions.
Yeah.
And this feels a bit more relatable, honestly, because we're all consumers, right?
Absolutely. This is where those assumptions about preferences, remember?
Yeah.
The idea that generally people prefer more to less,
Right.
that really comes into play here. Consumer demand functions, you see, they try to model how individuals make decisions based on their preferences, how much money they have, and, of course, the prices of those goods and services.
So it's like a mathematical representation of what motivates us to buy or not to buy certain things.
That's a great way to put it. The excerpts explain how economists approach this using this concept of utility maximization. It's this idea that people aim to maximize their satisfaction or utility given their budget constraints.
Right, because we only have so much money.
Exactly.
So think of it this way.
Yes.
We all have limited resources,
Right, do.
whether it's time, money,
Yes.
and we're constantly trying to get the most, I guess, bang for our buck in terms
Yeah.
of, our own personal satisfaction.
You got it. And you know what? These demand functions, they're absolutely central to understanding how markets, how they find that balance
Okay.
between that supply and demand, you see.
Right.
Which then determines the prices we actually see.
Right, which are constantly changing.
They are. Remember those supply and demand graphs from Econ 101.
Oh, yeah. The ones with the crossing lines.
Exactly. But you know what? Behind those seemingly simple graphs, there's a much richer story.
Okay.
The text here gets into how individual demand is, aggregated to form market demand, and how this then interacts with supply to determine those prices we see on everything from a cup of coffee to, well, to a car.
Right. And then those prices then influence individual decisions,
Yeah.
right? Which then affects those larger market dynamics. So it's like this continuous feedback loop.
You've got it. That feedback loop, it's constantly humming along in the background in every market,
Wow.
driving those fluctuations in, well, in prices, in quantities, even in the types of goods and services that businesses, choose to produce or offer.
Okay. So we've talked about demand, but the text also mentions this thing here called the Lagrange multiplier. Does that have anything to do with those like shadowy figures you see in like, spy movies?
Mm-hmm.
Because it sounds pretty intense.
Yeah. Not quite a shadowy figure, though I can see why the name might sound a bit intriguing.
Yeah.
The Lagrange multiplier,
Okay.
named after the mathematician Joseph Louis Lagrange, it's actually a really handy tool for solving what we call constrained optimization problems.
Constrained optimization
Yeah.
problems. Okay.
These are problems where essentially you're trying to maximize or minimize something, but with limitations, with constraints.
Okay. So like trying to plan like the most amazing vacation ever, but with a very, very limited budget.
Mhm.
Because that is a constrained optimization problem I face regularly.
That's a perfect example. You're maximizing enjoyment, but you're within the constraint of a budget.
Right.
And in economics, we see this all the time.
Right.
Maximizing utility, subject to a budget constraint, maximizing profits, subject to resource limitations, and so on. The Lagrange multiplier, you see, it basically tells us the shattered price of that constraint,
Okay.
how much more valuable that constrained resource, well, it becomes. So for your vacation example, it would represent how much more enjoyment you would get if you had, just a little bit more money to spend.
Like it's like quantifying the value of like loosening
Right.
those constraints.
Precisely.
So for a business, it might be like that additional profit they could generate with, just a little bit more capital or a larger workforce.
Exactly. It's about understanding those trade-offs, those opportunity costs. They're inherent in any decision-making process, really. The Lagrange multiplier, it's a really powerful tool for that.
Fascinating. And the text, it dives even deeper, talking about all these different types of utility function.
Oh, yes.
Cobb-Douglas, quasi-linear, homothetic, are these just different, like, mathematical flavors of happiness.
Yeah. That's a fun way to put it. They're essentially different ways to mathematically represent how individuals derive, that satisfaction
Okay.
from consuming goods and services. Each function has, slightly different properties that can lead to different predictions about consumer behavior.
So it's about capturing the nuances of how we as humans get our kicks.
Exactly. And, the choice of which utility function to use, it can actually have a significant impact on the outcome of these economic models.
Okay.
It can influence the shape of those demand curves that we talked about, how people might respond to price changes, even how income is distributed in a society. It's all interconnected.
Wow. Okay, I'm starting to notice a pattern here. Economists, they really love to classify things, don't they?
It's true. It's true. We do.
Different types of models, different types of functions. It's all about, categorization.
Well, there's a method to the madness, I promise.
Okay.
By categorizing and analyzing these different scenarios,
Yeah.
economists can gain a much deeper understanding of those forces that drive economic behavior.
So it's about creating a framework for understanding, a world that is inherently vast and complex. Instead of this like one giant messy picture, it's about breaking it down into understandable parts.
Precisely. And as we delve, deeper into these excerpts, we see even more examples of this categorization.
Okay.
The text here talks about income and substitution effects,
Okay.
the Slutsky equation, compensated demand.
Okay, those are definitely mouthfuls.
Aha, they are. But they're crucial for understanding how consumers respond to, those ever-changing prices and, of course, their income.
Okay, so break it down for me. What are these effects all about?
Okay, so let's say, for example, the price of, I don't know, your favorite cup of coffee, it suddenly goes up, right? The income effect, it describes how that price hike impacts your overall purchasing power. You essentially feel a bit poorer because you can either afford less of that coffee
Right.
Or you have to give up something else to keep enjoying that daily latte.
Makes sense. It's like my budget, just shrunk a little bit.
Exactly. Now, the substitution effect, this kicks in. As that price of your beloved coffee, it goes up,
Yeah.
you might start thinking, oh, maybe I'll switch to, a cheaper alternative like tea.
Right. Or start brewing it home a little bit more.
Exactly. You're substituting a less expensive good for the one that's now, more pricey.
So it's how we adjust our spending habits, our consumption habits in response to those price signals, right? We become more cost conscious.
Exactly. And the Slutsky equation,
Yeah.
it's named after the economist Eugen Slutsky.
Okay.
It provides a way to disentangle those income and substitution effects, to quantify how much of that change in your coffee consumption, is due to each effect.
It's like dissecting an economic decision,
Sure.
peeling back the layers to see those inner workings.
I like that analogy. And, understanding these nuances, it's crucial, not just for economists, but for policymakers, businesses, really anyone trying to understand how consumers make decisions in a world of, ever-changing prices and incomes.
Right, which is basically all of us, right?
Exactly.
Okay, shifting gears a bit here. The text starts talking about the labor-leisure trade-off.
Yes.
And this is something I think, again, we can all relate to.
Absolutely. It's a fundamental concept that explores how individuals, how they allocate their time
Okay.
between, working for income, that's the labor part,
Right.
and enjoying those leisure activities, that's the leisure part.
It's a classic balancing act, isn't it?
It is.
More work often means more income,
Right.
but less free time.
Exactly.
More free time often means, more relaxation, more enjoyment, but then also less income to spend on those things you enjoy. So it's tough choices.
Tough choices indeed. And this trade-off, it's influenced by, a whole bunch of factors. How
Yes.
much you earn per hour, your own personal preferences for, for leisure activities, even government policies, things like, say, taxes or, welfare programs.
Right. So it's about finding that, that sweet spot
Right.
between work and play that maximizes, I guess, your overall well-being.
Exactly.
And speaking of time, the text mentions something here called intertemporal choice, which sounds like we're about to travel through time.
It does have a bit of a sci-fi ring to it, doesn't it?
It does.
Intertemporal choice is essentially about understanding how individuals, they make decisions
Okay.
that involve costs and benefits that are spread out over different time periods.
Okay, so give me an example.
Think about something like, say, saving for retirement,
Okay, yeah.
investing in your education,
Mhm.
or even something as simple as, choosing between a small reward, like, say, a scoop of ice cream.
Always a tough choice.
It is a tough choice.
Very tough.
Versus, a larger reward later, like fitting into that awesome outfit that you've been eyeing.
So it's all about, balancing our present selves with our future selves.
You got it.
It's like an epic battle between, who I am right now
Yes,
versus who I want to be in the future.
exactly. And economists, they've developed these really fascinating ways to model these intertemporal choices,
Fine.
incorporating concepts like discounting, present value, time preference.
Discounting, like those 50% off sales. I'm
What?
always a fan of a good discount.
Huh. That's one type of discounting. But in economics, discounting refers to this idea that we tend to place a much higher value on receiving a reward today versus receiving that exact same reward in the future.
Right.
It's like saying $1 today is worth more to me than $1, say, tomorrow.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I mean, there's a certain immediacy to having that dollar in hand right now.
Right.
Versus having to, wait for it.
Exactly. And, economists, they use this concept of discounting to understand all sorts of things.
Like what?
Like, say, why people save money,
Okay.
how interest rates are determined,
Right.
even how businesses make those, those big investment decisions. It's all about weighing those present and future benefits against each other.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And while we're on the topic of making decisions across time, the text also mentions this idea of dynamic consistency,
Yes.
which to me sounds like, a very positive quality. It sounds like someone who always follows through on their plans.
It is considered a desirable trait. Dynamic consistency basically means that, your preferences over time,
Yeah.
they're aligned with each other. You don't make plans today that your future self will immediately regret
Right.
or change their mind about.
So it's about avoiding those, what was I thinking
Yeah,
moments when we look back on, some of our past
we've
decisions.
all been there.
We've all been there, right?
Yeah,
I mean, we make plans with the best of intentions,
we do.
and then when the time comes, our preferences shift, or
Yeah.
we get tempted by something else, or
It happens. We're only human, after all.
we're only human. Right, exactly.
But that dynamic consistency, it's a key assumption in a lot of economic models,
Yeah.
particularly, those dealing with saving, investment, decision-making over time.
So it's like those models just assume that we all have like
Right.
a perfectly rational and consistent time traveler living inside us, making sure our past, present, and future selves, that they're all on the same page.
That's a great way to put it. Of course, in reality,
Yeah,
things are a bit messier, right? Because our preferences or circumstances, they change over time.
right, they do.
But, that concept of dynamic consistency, it provides this really useful benchmark, I think, for understanding how people ideally should make decisions, over those different time periods.
Right, okay. So far, we've talked about how individuals make choices.
Yes,
And how economists, they really try to model those choices.
you do.
But the text takes a bit of a turn here, and now we're talking about uncertainty.
Ah, yes.
And let's be honest, there's a lot of uncertainty in the world.
There is a lot. Uncertainty is just this fundamental aspect of, well, many economic decisions, really.
Right.
We very rarely have perfect information about what the future holds.
Yeah, like what's the stock market going to do? Am I going to have a job next week? I mean,
exactly.
even something as, seemingly predictable as tomorrow's weather,
Right.
you never know.
You don't.
So how do economists grapple with this element of the unknown?
Well, they've developed these really interesting models of decision-making under uncertainty, and these models often incorporate things like probabilities and expected values. It's about understanding how people weigh those potential outcomes and make choices
Okay.
when they don't know for sure what will happen.
So it's like calculating the odds and then making, I guess, informed bets about the future.
In a way, yes, but it's more nuanced than that.
Okay.
Instead of just looking at, say, those potential payouts,
Yeah.
these models actually consider how much an individual values those payouts, you see.
Yeah.
Remember that idea of utility, that concept of satisfaction that we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
These models are trying to figure out how to maximize what we call expected utility
Oh.
in the face of uncertainty.
So it's not just about like the cold hard numbers,
No.
but how those numbers translate into like individual, satisfaction or well-being.
Right. Yeah. That's exactly right. It's about acknowledging that a dollar won't necessarily bring the same amount of happiness or satisfaction to every person in every situation.
Right. A dollar means a lot more to someone who doesn't have a lot of money versus someone who has, billions of dollars.
Exactly.
Okay, now this next term from the text might be like my favorite one yet. State contingent commodities.
It just sounds like something out of a science fiction novel.
I'll admit it does have a certain ring to it,
Yeah.
but it's not as complicated as it might sound.
Okay, good.
A state contingent commodity is essentially it's a good or service whose value, well, it's dependent upon a particular, state of the world
Okay.
or a very specific event happening.
Okay, that still sounds a bit abstract to me. Give me a real world example. Okay, sure. Think about insurance.
Okay.
You buy insurance,
Yeah.
whether it's, car insurance, health insurance,
Right.
even something like travel insurance. You buy it to protect yourself, in case something bad happens.
Right.
The value of that insurance policy, you see, it's contingent upon a specific event occurring. So if you get into a car accident,
Yeah.
your car insurance suddenly becomes incredibly valuable.
Right. Very glad I have it at that moment.
Exactly. But, if you don't,
Yeah.
it still gave you, that peace of mind, but you didn't actually need to, to use it.
Right. So it's like buying like protection against a very specific what-if scenario.
Exactly. And, state contingent commodities are crucial for understanding how individuals, how they manage risk and how markets function, in the face of uncertainty. It's about creating ways to hedge those bets against an unpredictable future.
It's like a safety net, but for the economy.
You got it.
And speaking of safety nets, we're all wired a little bit differently when it comes to risk.
No, absolutely.
Some of us are total thrill seekers.
Yeah.
And then others, they prefer to, They prefer to play it safe.
Absolutely. And that's where that concept of risk aversion comes in.
Okay.
It captures this idea that, generally speaking, people, they prefer a guaranteed outcome, you
Right.
see,
Yeah.
to a gamble with, with an equal expected value.
So you're saying, like, most people would rather just take a guaranteed $50 rather than, like, a 50-50 chance of winning, like, $100 or getting nothing at all,
Exactly.
even though statistically
Yeah.
that expected value is the same in both scenarios.
You've got it. And,
Economists use this idea of risk aversion to understand things like, investment behavior.
exactly. Why do you think insurance markets even exist?
Right. People are literally paying a premium to avoid that uncertainty, of a gamble.
Precisely.
Okay. Now, the text mentions a rather intimidating sounding term here, the von Neumann-Morgenstern utility function. Is this something like a supervillain would use to model their evil plans?
Uh, It does sound a bit ominous, I'll give you that.
It does.
But rest assured, it's not a tool for evil masterminds, at
Yeah.
least not usually. The von Neumann-Morgenstern utility function.
Okay.
It's basically just a very specific type of utility function that's designed to model those choices we make under uncertainty.
Damn it.
It helps economists understand and hopefully predict, an individual's choices among different gambles
Okay.
or risky options.
So it's like a mathematical blueprint for analyzing how we deal with risk.
That's a great way to put it. And it has really significant implications for fields like, like finance,
Right.
insurance, even game theory.
Wow. Okay. So we've got these utility functions, but now that text throws another term at us.
Yeah.
Mean variance analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Are we talking about like statistical averages here, how things are spread out? Because if so, you're taking me right back to statistics class. And honestly, it wasn't my favorite.
You're right on with the stats connection. Mean variance analysis, it's basically a way to simplify that whole process of decision-making under uncertainty, you see. So instead of getting bogged down in considering, every single possible outcome of a decision,
Right.
it just focuses on two really key characteristics: the expected value, or, the average outcome,
Okay.
and the variability, or, the spread of those potential outcomes.
So instead of getting like totally lost in the weeds, it's about getting, I guess, a quick read on those potential risks and rewards.
You got it. And this approach is particularly useful in, say, finance,
Oh, okay.
where investors are always trying to balance risk and potential return.
Right. High risk, high reward. Or
Exactly. Mean variance analysis allows for this, this relatively quick and easy way to compare, different investment opportunities.
That makes sense. It's like getting a quick snapshot of like a gamble's, attractiveness.
Precisely.
Okay. Now, the text takes a pretty sharp turn here. We're going from, all this talk of risk and uncertainty to suddenly talking about linear programming. Is this like a flashback to geometry class, or are we still doing economics here?
Don't worry, we haven't left the realm of economics entirely. But we are bringing in some tools from our friends in mathematics, I'll admit. Linear programming, it's essentially a method for optimizing.
Okay.
And by optimizing, I mean either maximizing or minimizing, a particular goal or an objective
Yeah.
when you have, all sorts of constraints.
Okay, paint me a picture here. Give me a real-world scenario where this would be useful.
Okay, sure. So imagine, for example, a company, right,
Okay.
that makes multiple products.
Okay.
Like, say they make cars and they make trucks.
Okay.
They have a limited amount of resources.
Right. Like everyone.
Right. Like steel, rubber, labor.
Right.
And they want to figure out, well, what's the absolute best mix of cars and trucks to produce
Okay.
to maximize those profits, you see?
Right. Okay.
That is a classic linear programming problem.
So it's about finding the best solution.
Yes.
But within a very specific set of limitations.
Exactly.
It's kind of like life, isn't it? Always trying to optimize happiness
Yeah.
within the constraints of, work, relationships, limited time.
So you got it.
All of that.
And, this approach, it has the really wide range of applications
Okay.
from things like, figuring out the most efficient way to, say, schedule flights,
Okay.
or optimizing, those delivery routes for packages,
Right.
to even figuring out how to best allocate investments
Okay.
in a portfolio, to get those highest returns. But of course, with the lowest possible risk.
Right. So it's like linear programming is like the ultimate efficiency tool.
It is.
Okay. And speaking of efficiency,
Yes.
the text mentions something here called a dual problem. Are we back to those like two sides of the same coin here?
You got it. Just like with the duality we talked about earlier, the dual problem in linear programming, it provides a a different perspective really on that same problem. It's like
Yeah.
it's like you're looking at the problem through, through a different lens.
Okay. So it's about recognizing, I guess, those hidden symmetries, those hidden relationships within these optimization problems, right?
Exactly.
Okay. I like it. Now, the text goes on to describe the simplex algorithm.
Hmm.
Is this like a secret code for solving these linear programming problems?
You could say that. The simplex algorithm, it's essentially just this really clever step-by-step procedure for
Hmm.
finding the absolute best solution to, well, to a linear programming problem.
So it's a recipe for finding that most efficient way to allocate resources
Yes.
or to achieve a goal, given, all those pesky real-world constraints.
Precisely. And the really beautiful thing about it is that it's remarkably efficient, even for incredibly complex problems, ones with like tons of variables, tons of constraints.
Right.
This algorithm is one of the main reasons why linear programming is just such a widely used tool. And not just in economics,
Right.
but in fields like, say,
Correct.
logistics,
Well,
engineering,
right.
even in things like artificial intelligence.
Wow. It's like the Swiss Army knife of optimization techniques.
Ah, I like it.
Okay. Now, the text seems to be shifting gears again here.
Okay.
We're moving from, we were in the micro, and it seems like now we're zooming out to the macro.
Yeah.
We're talking about general equilibrium. What does that even mean?
Buckle up because we're about to zoom out and look at the really, really big picture here.
Okay.
General equilibrium.
Yeah.
It's about understanding how all those different markets, within an economy.
Okay.
So those markets for goods and services, for labor, for financial capital,
Right. Okay.
how they all interact, and ideally how they reach, this kind of simultaneous balance.
So if we were looking at that model airplane we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
this would be like zooming out to see how it interacts with all the other planes, with the air traffic control system, even with like the weather patterns.
That's a great analogy.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. It's about understanding this complex interplay of supply and demand, but across every single sector of the economy. It's really the most comprehensive and the most interconnected view of how the economic system actually works.
That is a very, very zoomed out view.
It is.
So how do economists even begin to model something that massive, something that interconnected?
That is where it gets really interesting. The excerpts you shared, they talk about these different types of general equilibrium models, you see. They range from the very simple linear models for the very complex, nonlinear ones. So the linear models,
Yeah.
they tend to be a bit simpler. They assume things like constant returns to scale,
Okay.
meaning that, if you double all the inputs, you double the output. Right.
Okay.
And these fixed input-output relationships. And, these simpler models, they can provide some useful insights,
Okay.
but they don't always reflect the nuances of the real world.
So it's a trade-off
Yeah.
between, simplicity and accuracy.
Exactly.
Sometimes a basic model is a good starting point,
It is.
but you need, something much more sophisticated to capture that, that full complexity of the situation.
That's a great point. And you know what? That's where those nonlinear models, they come in. They can incorporate things like those diminishing returns that we talked about,
Right.
where, adding more of an input doesn't always lead to a proportional increase in output. Or they can incorporate things like increasing returns to scale, where producing more can actually lower that average cost. So
It's like those nonlinear models.
yes,
They're like the high-definition version
that's a great way
of
of
that economic reality.
That's a fantastic way to put it.
Okay, now, the text mentions something here called input-output coefficients. What are those? Are those like the secret ingredients
Mhm.
in an economic recipe?
You could say that input-output coefficients, they essentially just quantify the relationship between all these different sectors of an economy.
Okay.
They tell us, how much of, say, one good or service from one sector is needed to produce, another good or service in a completely different sector.
Okay, so an example might be like, how much steel goes into making a car.
That's a great one. Those coefficients, they capture those interdependencies.
Okay.
And by analyzing those relationships, economists can do some really fascinating things like like study the economic interdependence
Okay.
between different industries, or analyze, the impact of different economic shocks, like say, like a sudden spike in oil prices.
Right.
They can even try to, to forecast future economic trends.
Wow.
It's really all about tracing the flow of those resources and those goods, across that economic landscape.
That's incredible. It's like having, X-ray vision, but for the economy.
Uh-huh.
You can see how like everything is ultimately connected.
It is.
Now, while we're on this kind of like, global economic journey here,
Yes.
the text points out something here called the production possibilities frontier. Is this like a map of an economy's like, potential?
You're on the right track. The Production Possibilities Frontier, or what we call the PPF for short.
Okay.
It's a really handy way to just visually represent those maximum combinations of goods and services that, that an economy can produce. It's based on two key constraints.
Sure.
One, the available resources, so, think land, labor, capital.
Okay.
And then two, the existing technology.
So it's like a menu
Yes.
of what is possible for an economy at a very specific point in time.
Yeah.
But just like any good menu, I'm guessing there's some tough choices, some trade-offs involved here, right?
You always make the best analogies, and you're absolutely right about those trade-offs. The PQF, you see, it highlights this really important concept in economics that we call opportunity cost.
Okay.
So, to produce more of one good,
Yeah.
you generally have to sacrifice some production of another good.
Right. You can't have your cake and eat it too.
Exactly. At least not according to the PPF.
Right. Exactly. Now, while we're on the topic of like measuring, what an economy can produce,
Yeah.
the text brings up net national product, or, NNP.
Yes.
Is that like GDP's, cooler cousin or
Oh,
something?
I like that.
They're both measured kind of the same thing, right?
NNP and GDP, they're definitely related concepts, yes. But NNP, it takes things a step further. So while GDP, it measures the total value of, all the goods and services that are produced in an economy, NNP, it also accounts for the fact that, that over time, things wear out.
Right. Things break.
They do. Machines break down, buildings need repairs. Economists call this depreciation.
Okay. So NNP, it provides, I guess, like a clearer picture of an economy's, its sustainable output. It's taking into account the wear and tear.
Precisely. It's a much more realistic measure of an economy's productive capacity.
Okay.
Because it's considering, that we need to maintain and replace
Right.
our capital stock
Right.
just to keep things running.
Right. We can't just keep churning out, goods and services without reinvesting in the tools and the infrastructure that make that production even possible, right?
Exactly.
So where does maximizing, that NNP
Yes.
fit into this, like, this big picture of general equilibrium? Because the text seems to suggest that it's a pretty important goal.
It is a really important goal. Maximizing NNP, given those ever-present resource constraints, it's all about figuring out, how an economy can allocate its limited resources,
Right.
whether it's labor, capital, natural resources,
Right.
in a way that produces the most possible output.
So it's like solving this giant economic puzzle.
Yeah.
Right. Like finding that perfect configuration of, of production that creates the most value.
That's a great way to put it. And, this is where those general equilibrium models we talked about earlier, they can be really, really handy. They can help us understand how markets, prices, individual decisions can contribute to, to that optimal allocation of resources. And of course, to maximize that NNP, it's about finding those win-win situations, but for the economy as a whole.
Right. That's fascinating. So we've talked about, general equilibrium, but within a single economy, right?
Yes.
But what about on like a global scale? Because the text here mentions something called factor price equalization.
Yes.
Is that like global economic harmony or something?
It's a pretty powerful concept in international trade theory. In essence, it states that, that under certain conditions specifically, free trade, the prices of what we call, factors of production, things like wages, for labor, returns to capital.
Okay.
They will tend to equalize across different countries, even if those factors themselves, they can't move freely across borders.
Wait, really? So even if, like, workers can't just easily move from, from a country with low wages to a country with high wages,
Yes.
free trade can actually help to kind of like, level that playing field.
That's the idea.
That's a powerful idea.
It is a powerful idea. It's
Yeah.
based on this notion that trading goods and services, it can actually act as a substitute
Okay.
for the movement of labor and capital. So when countries specialize in producing what they're relatively better at,
Right.
what we call their comparative advantage,
Right.
and then trade with each other, they're essentially, they're sharing those resources.
Right.
And in the process, it allows for a much more, much more efficient allocation of those resources, but globally.
It's like a global economic arbitrage.
Yeah.
That capital and labor don't actually have to move if the goods themselves
Yes.
are flowing freely between those countries.
That's exactly it.
That's fascinating. But the text doesn't stop there.
Oh, no.
It introduces yet another, mouthful of a term.
Right.
The Rybczynski theorem.
Yes.
What's that all about?
Well, get ready for another fascinating insight into international trade. The Rybczynski theorem, it focuses on what happens when a country experiences a change in what we call its endowments.
Its endowments. And those are,
the amount of labor, the amount of capital, natural resources that a country possesses.
okay.
And it states that an increase
Yeah.
in one of those factors, it will lead to a boost in the production of the good that uses that factor more intensively.
Okay.
And a decrease in the output of that other good.
Okay. So let's say like a country suddenly discovers this this huge new oil reserve.
Yes.
Does that mean that like they'll start producing, way more oil, but then maybe fewer electronics?
That's exactly right. They've become relatively more abundant in oil, so they specialize more in that area.
Okay.
And, this theorem, it helps explain why we see certain countries, they specialize in particular industries. It's all about those relative abundances.
It's like the economy. It's this, it's this constantly rebalancing
It is.
system
Yeah.
based on all these shifts in resources.
It's true. It's constantly evolving.
It really is.
Okay.
Okay, so we've discussed efficiency, we've discussed productivity, we've discussed, international trade, all these really important
Force.
but somewhat impersonal, I guess, economic forces, right?
Right.
But now the text seems to be taking, maybe a bit of a turn here towards like the more human side of things.
Yeah.
We're talking about welfare economics.
Yes, that's a great observation. Welfare economics is precisely about that, evaluating, how well off individuals and society as a whole really are.
Okay.
It's about using these economic tools and principles to tackle, some really big questions about fairness,
Sorry.
about equity,
Right.
about how we can create a system that really benefits everyone.
Everyone. So it's like the branch of economics
Yes.
that focuses on like, the human side
Yes.
of the equation.
You got it. It
Yeah.
goes beyond simply maximizing output or maximizing efficiency and asks these deeper questions like, how is that output, actually distributed? Who's benefiting? And maybe even more importantly, who might be left behind? It's about understanding the impact of, economic policies, of market outcomes
Yeah.
on people's actual lives.
Right. It's refreshing to know that economists are concerned with more than just the numbers.
We are.
So
Yeah.
how do they measure something? Well, something is subjective, really, as
Yeah.
as welfare. And the text mentions something here called Pareto optimality. Is that like the economic equivalent of nirvana?
It is a pretty lofty goal in economics, that's for sure. Pareto optimality, it's named after the Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto, and it describes this state where essentially it's impossible to make one person better off without making someone else worse off.
Okay.
It's a theoretical ideal,
Right.
but it provides a really, really useful benchmark for evaluating efficiency. And for understanding those really tricky trade-offs that are inherent in any kind of, social choices that we have to make.
So it's like an economic utopia where the pie is sliced in such a way that everyone feels like they got a fair share.
In a way, yes. And while achieving perfect, Pareto optimality in the real world, it might be impossible.
Right.
It does provide, some valuable insights, I think, into how we can at least strive
Right.
for more equitable and more efficient economic outcomes.
I like that. Striving for those win-win scenarios.
Yeah.
Now, the text mentions something here called the contract curve. Is that where those, those win-win deals, are they hammered out?
Essentially, yes. The contract curve, it visually represents all of those Pareto optimal allocations.
Oh.
Those points where no one can be made better off without making someone else, worse off. But it's in this very specific type of economy called an exchange economy,
Right.
where people are essentially trading existing goods with each other.
Okay.
So it's a really powerful way to see, those possibilities for mutually beneficial exchange.
It's like highlighting the potential for cooperation
Exactly.
and finding solutions where,
Yes.
where everyone can benefit.
Exactly.
I like it.
Yeah.
Now, so far, we've mostly been talking about, efficiency
Right.
in all its forms.
Yes.
But what about just, fairness?
Yeah.
Doesn't economics also care about just, basic equity?
It absolutely does. And that's where all those, those really important discussions about equity, they come into play.
Okay.
You see, while efficiency, it's all about maximizing the size of the economic pie, right?
Okay.
Equity focuses on how that pie is divided, who gets which slice.
Right. It's one thing to have, like, a growing economy.
Yes.
But it's another thing entirely to make sure that that growth is actually benefiting everyone, not just a select few.
That's exactly right. And that's why, welfare economics, it really grapples with these really complex issues,
Okay.
like income inequality,
Right.
poverty,
Right.
access to, to good education,
Right.
access to affordable health care.
Right.
These are those fundamental factors you see that really shape, opportunities and ultimately well-being. It's about understanding how economic policies and market forces,
Yeah.
they influence those really important outcomes.
Right. It's like that old saying, a rising tide doesn't necessarily lift all boats.
That's exactly right.
Okay. Now, the text mentions these concepts here of consumer surplus
Yes.
and producer surplus.
Yeah.
Are those ways to measure, like, how happy people are in the economy, like how much people are benefiting?
They're definitely related to well-being. Think of consumer surplus as a way to measure the benefit that consumers get from a transaction, right?
Okay.
So it's the difference between what they're willing to pay for, say, a good or service,
Okay.
and what they actually end up paying.
Okay. So, like, if I'm willing to pay, like, $5 for a cup of coffee,
Yes.
but I managed to snag it for $3 on special lamp,
Yes.
my consumer surplus is $2.
Yeah, exactly.
And that makes me a very, very happy consumer.
You've captured that extra bit of value.
I have.
And producer surplus
Yeah.
is just the flip side of that coin.
Okay.
It's the benefit that producers receive
Right.
from a sale. So it's the difference, again, between the price they receive
Right.